爆号外ニュースということで、ゴリが予想していた通り、アメリカの SBR 準備金が20万ビットコイン。
Order make it more likely that in the future, Bitcoin will be a geopolitically important currency or asset. Will other governments look to follow the US's lead and build their own strategic reserve?
ほじってるあれだけを SBR にするだけじゃなくて、今後さらに新しく購入していくビットコインを、これが出てくるはずだよねと言った通り、なんと先生ルミス上院議員が、SBR 法案を申請することを宣言、そしてその内容が驚愕の向こう20年間保持る、そして10年間で100万ビットコイン購入計画、イーチャーテル、そしてさらに追い打ちをかけるようにマイクロストラテジーのストラテジーマイケル・セーラーが21ビリオンのお金を使って25万ビットコイン分をさらに購入すると、いうことを発表、ストライク、アットダマーケット。
I really think the market has this wrong. You're 100% correct that the market is short-term disappointed that the government didn't come out and say it's going to immediately start acquiring 100 or 200,000 Bitcoin. It did say it will look for budget-neutral ways to do so in the future, and I expect the U.S. government to figure out a way to increase its Bitcoin stores over time. But regardless of that, I think that's the wrong question to ask. I think the right question to ask is, did this executive order make it more likely that in the future, Bitcoin will be a geopolitically important currency or asset? Will other governments look to follow the US's lead and build their own strategic reserve? And to me, the answer to that is emphatically yes. The reason that question matters is that's the question that determines if Bitcoin is, $80,000 a coin or $1 million a coin. So I think this is a short-term setback. I think the market will soon find its footing and realize that actually this is incredibly bullish long-term for this asset and for crypto.
どういうことかといったら、今49万9000ビットコインをストラテジーが持っているけれども、21ビリオンを使って、21ビリオンドルを使って25万ビットコイン、つまりあと50% さらに追加をするということ。これがいかにやばいか。これ、トータルで75万ビットコインになると。で、アメリカが向こう10年で100万ビットコインを買ってくって言ってるわけだから、ね、その 75% の75万ビットコインをストラテジーがね、今年、というか、むしろ今の状態でもね、向こう1ヶ月ぐらいで75万ビットコイン到達するから、それよりも凌駕するのをアメリカは10年かけてやっていくと。で、それ20年間ほどると。いうことで、これ完全にビットコインね、これからもっと来るよねっていうことを明らかにした、お前らちびってんじゃねえよっていうのを、世界最強のアメリカと世界最強のビットコイン貯蓄企業であるストラテジー。ストラテジーは世界で1番、2番目と 10倍以上の差をね、つけてるぐらいビットコインの保持量が高い。それらを見せつけてくれたクジラン、ね、それ中についてゴリ。
Here we go. Bitcoin was under 8,000 earlier today.
Buy it.
Regardless, though, of the drop. If I said to you Bitcoin dropped to 5,000, you'd say buy it.
Buy it. Because here's the thing. The daily price of Bitcoin doesn't matter. It's been alive for 10 years. In every year, other than one, 2015, it's made a higher low. The market cap has grown every single year. Every fundamental indicator of Bitcoin, usage, wallets, block size, transaction size, number of transactions, every single one, hash rate, making new highs. All of the indicators of the network and the network value are rising. The price of any asset fluctuates. Let's take Amazon. Amazon has been a public company for 20 years. In every year, including this year, it's at a double-digit drawdown. The average peak to trough, minus 31%. Twice, minus 90%. When was the right time to sell? Never. Who's owned it since the IPO to today? Jeff and his mom and dad. That's it.
All right. We're going to leave it there, Mark.
All right,
Good to
thanks.
see you. Thank you, Mark Yusko, Morgan Creek Capital.
Outcast.
ビットコインの売却、今売ってるやつは完全に誤りであり、完全にローティー情弱、ね、マーケットから退場されてあたぼう。将来的な価格上昇がもう確定、決まった。そして戦略的ビットコイン備蓄が、ね、もう来たと。アメリカ宣言して、いかに、ね、ゴールド証券からビットコインに変えるかっていうのを、タックスペイヤーのお金を使うことなく、向こう10年間で、100万ビットコインをね、さらに追加をするということね。で、短期的な恐怖と長期的な成長の機会。で、今こそ、ね、ウォーレン・バフェットが言うように買うべき。ビットコインのネットワーク成長と市場データの強さ、政府のデジタル資産貯蓄と戦略的準備金の重要性、FRB の金融政策、CPI ね、インフレがね 2.8% で、これパウジー利下げするんじゃないのって、これアメリカにとっていいことだよねって話と、ね、スマートマネーと戦略としての買い増しの機会ということで、買うやつは ね、今後ビットコイン20年後、
Not picking favorites, obviously, except I will say this. We do think Bitcoin is special, and I can get into the reasons
explain why. That's a great thing, yeah.
Well,
explain
I mean, Bitcoin's the original cryptocurrency. It's the first one. It's the only one that doesn't have an issuer, right? It's very decentralized. It's, in crypto, they call this the Immaculate Conception. We don't really know how it got here. We don't know who Satoshi is. It's almost mystical, you would say.
Yes.
It's the most valuable one. It has a $2 trillion market cap, and it's the most secure. It's never been hacked, right? So we're now, over 15 years into this journey, and there's been a lot of people who've been skeptical along the way, and there's been a lot of ups and downs, but here it is. I mean, I remember back in 2011, I think it's the first time I bought a Bitcoin. I think it was at $120. Now it's at $90,000. Again, there've been all sorts of wild swings along the way, but this thing just keeps chugging along. And you can think of that $2 trillion market cap as like a $2 trillion bug bounty. If there was a way to hack this, there's every incentive in the world. And by hack, I mean like to double spend, create basically a counterfeit Bitcoin, I guess would be the way for people to think about it. And
it is a miracle it hasn't been compromised. I think we can all say that.
Well, I don't know if it's a miracle. I think it's exceptional design.
Sure.
And so I think what you could say is that it's been tested in a very robust way, and there's been every incentive to basically break the encryption, and it continues to chug along. And so I think the price has gone up as the protocol has gotten more acceptance. And this is another point, is that Bitcoin is the most widely accepted as a store of value throughout the world.
Yeah.
So we do believe it should be treated special. Now, that being said, we're also creating the digital asset stockpile. So all the other digital assets.
Explain the difference between these two. So there's a digital asset stockpile. That's the picker. And then on the other side, there's a strategic reserve for Bitcoin.
So we have the reserve and we have the stockpile. So the reserve is just Bitcoin. The goal is long-term preservation. Think of it as like a digital Fort Knox for digital gold. We want to put the digital gold in there. We want to keep it secure. We never want to sell it. That's the goal of the reserve. And you're right that we've made the mistake in the past of selling this stuff. At one point in time, we had about 400,000 Bitcoin on the federal balance sheet. We sold roughly half of that for something like $360 million total. If we had held all of that, it would be worth, just that the portion we sold would be worth over 17 billion. So we made this mistake of prematurely selling Bitcoin when we should have held it. We don't want to make that mistake with regard to the rest of it. That's Bitcoin. Okay, so then you got the stockpile. Let me just talk about that. So first of all, like I said, we don't know exactly what digital assets the federal government has. I've seen reports that it might have, for example, 50,000 ETH, which is Ethereum. But again, we need to get to the bottom of that. When we figure out exactly what the assets are, we're going to move them into the digital stockpile. The purpose of the stockpile is responsible stewardship. It's a place for safekeeping. It's a centralized, you could say, account under the direction of the Secretary of the Treasury. And the Secretary of the Treasury will figure out how to maximize the values of these holdings. Now, there's a couple of important differences between stockpile and reserve. So one is the reserve, the executive order actually provides that the Secretary of the Treasury will not sell the Bitcoin. Okay, we're prohibited from selling the Bitcoin. There's no such prohibition with respect to the stockpile. If the Secretary of the Treasury decides that's in the long-term interest of the U.S. to rebalance the portfolio or change the portfolio, the Secretary has the discretion to do that.
Okay, which makes sense because there's a long tail of crypto. We might see something that we don't have the ability to predict the future, and we don't have the staff to sit there and look at these assets every day. So maybe the decision with Ethereum is, hey, this thing's waning. We just put it into Bitcoin because we know that's the more solid one. Yeah, that's what I'm reading into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's largely fair. I mean, look, I think that the stockpile should be subject to good portfolio management, right? And fortunately, we have a Secretary of the Treasury who is an extremely successful former hedge fund manager. So he's going to figure out the best way to manage these assets. And we give him the flexibility to do portfolio management. But the reserve is different, right? The reserve is just digital Fort Knox. Now, there's one other important difference between stockpile and reserve. So with respect to reserve, the EO provides that the secretaries, and I'm talking about Treasury and Commerce, they're allowed to figure out strategies to accumulate more Bitcoin for the reserve if those strategies are budget neutral and don't cost the taxpayer anything, okay? So it's possible that we could, I'm not saying that we will, but it authorizes them to acquire more Bitcoin if they can figure out a way to do it that doesn't impact the federal budget or the deficit or taxpayers.
コインをね、アメリカ政府がhodlる20年間で、ね、売られないから一定量は、これで、割らない情弱、ね、今、短期でしか見られないものは釣りができない。 お前、釣り堀ってすぐに釣れると思うか？今、釣り堀状態で今、ビットコインは、アメリカ政府世界最強が来て、ストラテジーも来て、ブラックロックも来て、ね、釣り堀には、ね、マグロが泳いでるよ、今、養殖の。だからといって、お前、すぐ釣れないからって、お前、ああだこうだ、ピーチクパチク言ってんじゃねえよ、お前。言っちゃってる。ケツバと。釣りってのは、己と向き合う、一番最高の男磨きなんだよ。サウナと一緒だよ。サウナに入って男磨き、自分のことを考える時間、静寂。それと一緒。待つのもマーケット。すぐに釣れないからって、ああだこうだ言ってる短期時間軸、お前釣りもしたことねえのかって。お前男として釣りで餌を投げた、フライフィッシング、これしてたけど、ね、あれ釣れないじゃん。ね、これ何回もやるんだよ。ね、釣れない時もあるんだよ。海に出て、船出して。それで、お前、わーだこうだって、お前アホかと。ビットコインね、すぐ買ったからってね、すぐに利益がね、出ないね、ちょっと下がって、ね、含み損になってるからって、ああだこうだって。お前釣りに行ってこいていうか、そんなやつお前クジラにビットコイン渡せ。お前らみたいのはすぐに損切りして売られて安値でゴリが買いたいから損切りしろということで、いってらっしゃい。